Welcome to episode 487. This week, the Supreme Court has heard oral arguments in a case that could overturn Roe v. Wade. This has got activists on both sides either really upset or really excited. We break down what the implications of a post-Roe reality might look like, how the pro-life movement might evolve, and what we can learn from the era of Prohibition. Then I talked to researcher Josh Packard about Springtide Research Institute's new report on the state of religion and young people 2021, and why Gen Z has such a negative perception of the church and such an inflated view of themselves. All of that, plus why the fastest growing search term on Bible Gateway this year makes us questioning the sanity of the American church. Here is Holy Post episode 487.
Hey there, this is Phil. Welcome back to the Holy Post podcast. I am here with Caitlin Shess. Hi, Caitlin.
Hi, Phil.
How are you?
I'm good. Yeah.
Fantastic. And Skye Jatani. Hi, Skye.
Hi, Phil.
Looking good. And Jason Rugg. Hi, Jason.
Hey there.
How's it going?
Good. How are you?
I'm just fine, thank you. We're having unseasonably warm weather.
It's beautiful out.
That's fun. Caitlin has finished her first semester at Duke Divinity School. And
Yeah.
Did you get Rookie of the Year?
I told you there are no awards for your first semester.
But there are awards coming.
Yeah, they're coming.
Probably not.
Has anyone there tipped you off to what awards you're likely to win?
No. What?
Which ones are you eligible for?
There are no awards on the horizon.
We want to play Caitlin Shess Award Bingo. So we'll each have a little chart of all the possible awards one can win at Duke Divinity School, and then you'll tell us every week which one you won, and when we'll see if we get bingo. Who gets bingo first?
I think you're
something.
actively trying to keep me from having friends, is what it sounds like you're doing.
No, because no one there listens to the podcast, so it's okay.
Yeah, we're not serious enough for the students at Duke.
Yeah.
False.
We are. What is the opposite of serious if you don't want to say a different word than serious? Unserious? Aserious? Serious?
Silly?
Unserious. Silly.
No, I said if you don't want to say a different word than serious.
Unserious.
Oh, yeah.
Like,
you got to put a prefix.
I like I was which prefix? I want aserious. I am aserious.
Or serious.
Serious. Serious. Yes, that's what your dentist says when he finds a really bad cavity. Serious. And now the theme song. What's the news that you like the most? Who's your favorite podcast host? If it's breakfast, get your toast. It's Skye and Phil and the Holy Post. Skye and Phil and the Holy Post. And sometimes Caitlin. Caitlin, it's too early in the podcast to be shaking your head at me. It's too early. We haven't even gotten to any of the stories yet, and you're already shaking your head.
There's nothing else for me to do, so.
Okay, well, we'll give you something else to do. What do you think, Caitlin Shess, if I may call you Caitlin Shess, what do you think was the number one fastest growing search term on Bible Gateway in 2021? We're nearing the end of the year, so everyone is kind of looking at their data for the year. Let's all review our data, see what was remarkable. So which search term, a single word, in searches, biblical searches, one word, grew the most between 2020 and 2021?
Apocalypse?
Oh, that's nice. That's
a good guess. That's a good guess.
Thank you.
People would have to be able to spell it to search for it, though, which may have decreased that. Skye, do you have a guess?
I was going to say Fauci, but that'd probably not be in there.
In the Bible, Skye.
Well, people, they have the Bible code kind of stuff where you can find any word with a...
Right, okay. Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. Fauci must be in there somewhere.
So what's the answer, Phil?
You're done?
Yeah.
Jason, you got a guess?
I was going to guess plague, but I'm not sure because we already had that in 2020. So I don't know.
Right. We're halfway through our plague.
How about insurrection?
No, you're wrong. You're all wrong. You're all wrong. You don't know your Bible or 2021. The answer is sorcery.
Ooh.
Sorcery. Okay.
Why?
Sorcery. Why sorcery was the fastest growing search term on Bible Gateway in 2021. The Greek word pharmakeia,
Oh, right.
has been popping up in debates over COVID-19 prevention measures, particularly opposition to such by some charismatic and evangelical Christians to vaccines and against the disease. Searches for the words sorcery and sorceries saw the biggest spike of all last year, increasing more than 200% over the prior year. And it's not because of witchcraft. It's rather the curiosity over what the Bible has to say about sorcery is related to heightened interest in the Greek word pharmakeia, which, according to one Greek English dictionary, means employment of drugs for any purpose, sorcery, magic, enchantment. So
people are looking up the idea of sorcery in the Bible because they're trying to link it to the COVID vaccine as somehow a demonic drug.
yes, one prominent anti-vaccine activist, Sherry Tenpenny, which is a very, very inexpensive drink you can get. In March 25th video, she took aim at pastors, priests, and rabbis who closed their houses of worship during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic and later opened them as vaccination centers and said, no doubt this is pleasing the pharmakeia, the sorcerers.
So this is the worst. I mean, it is just the worst.
I'm not even done giving you the stuff to react against.
But it's still the worst.
Hold your response. Hold your response. In April 8th, she again mentioned church leaders opening their sanctuaries to sorcerers to administer COVID-19 vaccines, which she believes are, quote, experimental genetic modification tools that will, quote, permanently mark recipients. What about Jesus healing the sick with his hands and with prayer? Our Lord would have never turned to the pharmakeia, the sorcerers, overlooking his Father's results. Christian singer and former American Idol contestant Danny Gokey. Were you a big fan of Danny Gokey?
Skye? Never heard of him.
I think it's a him.
It's a him.
Also referenced pharmakeia. Oh, we got a fan. We've got a fan of Danny Gokey. Show us your collection of.
I watched that season of American Idol, but that is all I know.
Okay. He referenced pharmakeia in a series of tweets earlier this year, linking COVID-19 vaccines to the mark of the beast mentioned in the biblical book of Revelation.
Wait Revelations, and his credentials for being a biblical expositor is the fact that he's a Christian who was on American Idol. Isn't idolatry also unbiblical? Maybe he's the beast.
Okay.
Wow.
I mean, the logic is about as solid as what he's using for Revelation.
Yeah. Gokey tweeted earlier this month that Revelations also emphasizes how the whole world will be deceived by pharmakeia. So the pharmaceutical industry is a deceiver and a sorcerer, and that's why you can't get vaccinated.
Did he say Revelations?
Yes, he did.
Okay, well then we're already off the bat. No.
The book of them. The book of all of them. Multiple
this is like a favorite of armchair theologians to just say that the etymology of a word happens to share an etymology with another word, and therefore they're the same thing.
Yes.
But what comes to my mind, right, like the word oikonomia is a Greek word meaning household, and it's also the origin of the word economy. So does that mean that every time the Bible speaks of a home or household, it's actually code language for the economy because they come from the same Greek root?
I don't know, Skye. You tell me.
But that's the same law. It's just absurd. Like there's so many English words that find their origins in some Greek prefix or Greek word. I mean, Caitlin, you've studied Greek more recently than I have. You probably think of a dozen words off the top of your head.
She's studying it right now. While we're podcasting, she's studying Greek.
No. But you're right. I mean, it is also one of those things where people, and evangelicals are prone to this, so it makes sense why we would be susceptible to this, of thinking that you can interpret scripture with tools like a dictionary that lets you look up Greek words without any prior training or without immersion in a larger tradition that gives you guidelines to know when you've gone off track. I mean, we had access in seminary to like a free software that lets you look at words. And some of us were in programs where we were taking Greek and Hebrew, and we were spending semester after semester and hours of study to learn how to use those tools right. But everyone in the seminary had access to them. And I had friends that I had to kind of talk down from using these tools and saying, oh, this word shows up in this passage and it's translated this way. But in this other passage, it's translated a different way. So in this first one, I'm going to use the word that was used in the second. Like, would do all of these weird, wacky things because we have access to technological tools that let us look up those words without any of the training associated to know why they're translated in the context they're in, the different forms they come in. And then you get all sorts of wild interpretations that don't mean anything because people think they can be an expert because the internet exists instead of recognizing that it takes training to know how to use those tools.
Caitlin, if there's anything we learned from the Reformation, it is all I need is the Bible, the Holy Spirit, and the internet.
Nope.
That is what I need.
That is not what we learned.
That is what we learned.
Ironically, we learned that people who have power can exert it to persuade other people of false theological ideas. And that is continuing to be true because someone with a huge internet presence has a lot of power. And if they tell you that a Greek word means something else, and so it means that the COVID vaccine is from the devil, then you'll believe them.
Okay, but if we just go with their completely bonkers interpretation, that any pharmaceutical is essentially sorcery.
Because the Bible says so. Skye.
Then isn't that a prohibition against any medications, not just the COVID vaccine?
Well, some things have been around so long, they're no longer really pharmaceuticals, like Advil. Advil is no longer a pharmaceutical. It's just now the little thing, the little orange
So it's
thing.
only new
things.
Drugs
new
and
things. Well,
vaccines
new things
that are problematic.
After new things that were created after we stopped trusting pharmaceuticals, or each other.
But if pharmakeia means sorcery and it's the same root as the word pharmaceutical, then does just by their own logic, all pharmaceuticals are demonic sorcery and should not be engaged. I mean, in what you read, didn't Jesus heal people by touching them and praying for them?
He did.
Shouldn't that's like an argument for Christian Science that we should all run away from medicine and just
now that we know
pray.
That extensive prayer can actually grow back hair, and if you're watching on YouTube, you'll be the only ones who understand that reference. I think you could build a good case.
You don't know that this wasn't drug-induced.
Boy, is that true. Okay. I think all of this may be drug-induced. Okay, so people are getting a little... you might have to look at a picture to see what we're talking about.
Do you think people are making this argument sincerely, or are they deliberately deceiving people?
Do you remember Skye Jitani? Can I call you that?
Yeah.
Okay, I will anyway. Skye, do you remember, Skye, when you made an argument a few weeks ago, and I believe you picked it up from Bonhoeffer, that the real problem is dumbness?
No, it was stupidity.
I know, I don't use that word. That's a mean word.
Well, that's Bonhoeffer's. That's the word he used. I'm not.
Yeah, I know, but I'm not even going to quote. I'm not even going to quote mean words, Skye.
Okay.
That there was much more than evil was dumbness.
Okay.
Dumbnity.
Yeah.
I think maybe you were right, because it is really hard to look at some of this stuff and say, that's an
How about the word asininity? I like that word.
Oh no, that has the donkey in it. We can't say
No,
that.
it doesn't.
Shh.
It's from
One
asinine.
S.
Is it one S? Oh, then that's okay. That's okay.
See, you're making the same error. You think just because the word sounds like another word, it must have the same origin and meaning, but it doesn't.
No, it's the appearance of sin, Skye. It's the appearance of sin. Because if I say that and then someone stops listening after the S, it appears that I've sinned.
Which, ironically,
both my grandmothers will come back from the grave to slap me on either sides of my face.
The irony is such an act of like canceling the show because they didn't like the word would in itself be an act of asininity.
Oh, wow.
Getting too meta now.
Transitioning, I want to transition into the abortion thing because stuff is going on, significant stuff is going on at the Supreme Court. Some things, I don't know if you've noticed, but the left of the spectrum is is going ballistic right now, that the conservatives have taken over the Supreme Court and they're ending Roe versus Wade, and this is like the worst case scenario, and there's a panic. And it is a little surprising that it's happened. It's going this far, this fast. Are you surprised, Skye?
Slightly, but not terribly.
Okay.
I'll be more interested in what the aftermath is, because I think some people, if they overturn Roe, what's the aftermath? Because on one side, I think too many people have the false impression that this is the silver bullet which ends abortion in America, which it isn't. And on the other side, there are a ton of people who feel like, you might as well make America into a theocracy. It's the end of liberal freedoms, blah, blah, blah. So there's both extremes, I think, have a false understanding of what's really at stake here.
Yes. Mm-hmm. I agree that is true. I don't know how much you've read about, how likely people think.
I'm too itchy. It's so itchy. I can't keep it up.
We're talking about serious topics. Skye just removed his hair. For those of you listening at home, he was wearing false hair because he was so envious. He was so envious of Jason's luxurious locks that was he put on luxurious locks of his own, and now
that was my toupee from Halloween, which sits on my glass head over here. And it was cold, so I put it on. And actually, it does keep you warm. It's my little hair hat.
Why do you have a glass head?
You don't?
No.
You know what they say? People with glass heads should not eat stones. It's an old, yeah. Okay. Can we get back to the serious topic?
Yeah.
Please.
Yeah. Okay. Here's what I think is interesting. There is, a lot of posturing going on right now. A lot of people on the left saying we have to get ready for this, and we have to nationalize abortion laws through legislation, or we have to turn our states into abortion sanctuaries, and then fund women escaping the theocratic states, in their red robes and white bonnets to come and to our states to be free. And then on the other side is, we're just starting. This is the first step to getting rid of abortion entirely. And it feels like someone wrote a piece that said that had described Roe v. Wade. This was a piece written from the left side of the spectrum, described Roe v. Wade as the glue holding America together. And what they were saying is that if you take, like a Band-Aid, if you take this away, then it's going to go down to the state level, and it's going to be such a mess that it's going to be chaos. This is going to unleash absolute legislative chaos on a state-by-state basis.
There's a lot of issues that are legislated on a state-by-state basis.
But as messy as this one, because the conservative argument has always been Roe v. Wade has created this polarization, that by taking the decision away from the states and away from the legislative process, that's partly what brought about all this polarization. So I don't know, Caitlin, help me out. Which do you agree with?
I do think there's a true identification there, that there is something really distinct about the abortion debate and polarization. And some of it is the way that it's become sort of like an identity marker for both the right and the left, right? Like there's no coherent ideology sometimes. It's just, I'm pro-abortion or I'm anti-abortion in ways that don't make sense. Like, especially sometimes I'll see it on the left of like, you've totally abandoned safe, legal, and rare. And you're really just, it's become such an identity marker that you want to be just pro-abortion. But there is another aspect for why it's become so polarized, or not become, but just is so polarized, is because it's a policy issue that is on its face. It's so hard to turn into the way that we talk about other policy issues, where we obscure all of the philosophical questions, the theological questions about what are humans and what does a flourishing life look like and what should our communities be, we're really good at taking policies that deal with those deeper philosophical questions and pretending like they don't actually deal with them, like they're just policy questions. The abortion one, you can't pretend that there aren't really deeply philosophical questions at stake. Like, is a human life ending or not? It's not solely a medical question, and it's not a policy question. It's a really deeply philosophical, theological question. And those are the kinds of questions that navigating, negotiating a common life together requires dealing with those questions, not in making everyone come to the same exact conclusion. That's impossible. But in figuring out how to live together and recognize that we have to share some things, and like actually having debates that have those philosophical, theological questions clash, instead of acting like when you come out in the public square, you leave behind all of those weightier metaphysical matters and you just talk about policy. You can't do that with abortion. And I think it's harder to pretend like you can do that. And so I think there's not just the issue of we're so polarized, pro-life, pro-choice. There's also the issue of we are really, really bad at having political conversations that deal with those deeper philosophical, theological issues, because we don't practice having those conversations in any other area of policy. So then we get to abortion and we don't know how to have that conversation. It's impossible because we don't have the language for, okay, I'm a Christian and I'm going to come into the public square and I might not use really like specific theological language to talk about why I want abortions to be really rare if they exist at all, or am I against abortion kind of, philosophically. I don't have the language for how to do that in a way that appeals to people, in a way that negotiates life together, because I'm so used to thinking the way that I engage policy conversations is without all of that stuff. And so I think there's something true about like when that's an open question and a state-by-state basis, there's a lot of chaotic, like we're not used to having those kinds of conversations. I can imagine that being really chaotic and really uncomfortable for people. But I also think the answer to that is not obviously avoid the conversation. It's like, especially for Christians and churches to go, okay, are we preparing ourselves for engaging in those conversations? Those are really difficult questions for, spiritual leaders to be thinking about. What does it mean for us to take that theological, philosophical stuff into the public square in an appropriate way, in a way that isn't a theocracy, in a way that isn't, just seeking to kind of, plow everyone out of our way? That's like way harder than just avoiding those questions in our policy conversations.
You're right, Caitlin, but I have to believe it's possible because somehow a lot of other developed democracies have figured out how to do this and have more reasonable restrictions on abortion than even the United States has.
But they put those more reasonable restrictions in place before it became an issue that defines your political tribe, didn't they?
That may be, but this is a complicated issue for many, many, many reasons. But let's say Roe is overturned. Let's say a whole bunch of more conservative red states put severe restrictions on abortion, and some extreme blue states throw off all the restrictions, and it's super accessible and very few or any restrictions on it. In that environment, the church has to step in and figure out how to persuade without resorting to political power. And this is where the analogies to slavery break down, in my view, because some Christians have come after me of things I've said about abortion. Well, like, would you be okay if they still allowed slavery? It's just evil and needs to be outlawed completely. I agree. The difference is, if you were an African American in 1850 in Mississippi, you could be set free. Your slave owner could set you free. You could buy your freedom some ways. But even if you were technically free, you still were denied equal rights as a black person in America. You couldn't vote. You couldn't own property. There's a bunch of things you could not do. The state is not saying that every unborn or preborn child must be aborted. It's saying it's the woman's choice, which means as the church, we don't need to primarily persuade the government to change its policies. We need to persuade women and communities and households and families to change their positions on this and their approach to the preborn. So it's a different tactic and it's a different issue. And yes, there are legal things we ought to pursue, but there's a lot more than just legal things. And that's where I think many of us fail in our imaginations to understand what this issue really requires.
Can I raise my concern, Skye?
Sure.
Okay. I'm worried about how this has become so ideological. And when we're completely ideological, we lose sight of the practical. So if you're on the left, this has become so ideological that abortion rights are in the Constitution, and there should be no restrictions. I mean, it's like the NRA. It's like the NRA with gun rights. We have to oppose any restriction on abortion, and you ignore the practicalities of there are women that suffer from having had abortions that weren't medically necessary, maybe even weren't economically advisable. In other words, it didn't need to happen, and there's a downfall from that. There's a cost to pay. And then on the right side, the idea that we'll just make it completely illegal in all instances to have an abortion, and we forget about the ramifications, the practical ramifications, either ethical or medical or health of the mom. But we don't think about one of the things that we may be headed into is that it becomes much, much harder to get an abortion, mostly for the very poor. So if you have money, you just cross state lines. You just, it's like medical tourism. You just hop on a train, you hop on a bus, you hop in a car, you hop on a plane.
Or increasingly, you just order a pill because so many more are happening chemically now.
True. But the women least likely to be able to do that. So the women most likely to have children they did not want to have will be the most poor women, which means if there is an increase in childbirth because of this, it's going to be kids born into some of the worst circumstances. And to just think about that and say, okay, so even if that's the outcome we want, what are we going to do to help?
Right.
What on earth are we going to do when you take you kind of cherry pick the worst situations for kids to be raised in and then force more kids to be raised in those situations?
So then the argument needs to be, if you live in a state, let's say Roe's overturned, if you live in a state that's likely to severely restrict or outlaw abortion altogether, then what other policies will you advocate for in your state to help poorer families, communities that are under-resourced, education, single moms, access to good health care? I mean, on and on. But the problem is, the irony is, in some states that want to outlaw abortion, they also want to severely limit
those
social safety nets.
Those things are all grouped together. It's all grouped together. So it's the church that should be jumping in to say, before this goes through, are we ready for this? Let's set up our society to help these kids that we're demanding be born effectively into terrible circumstances. Let's set up systems to help those kids, except that we've also decided that that's liberal. So we don't want to do that either. And we say it's personal responsibility. If a parent wants to raise their kids in abject poverty so the kid suffers, well, that's the parent's responsibility. There's nothing I can do about that, which is exactly the opposite we say about abortion. It's not a parent's responsibility. It's my responsibility to stop you from ending your pregnancy. Once you've had the child, it's not my responsibility to help that child grow up. So and then I want to raise something else. I want to bring up prohibition. Okay, can I bring up prohibition?
Like the alcohol prohibition.
Yes, 1920s. The prohibition of alcohol. Okay, you're looking at me a little weird, Caitlin. This is going to be good. Just stick with me.
I'm waiting.
When the drive for prohibition started, there was almost zero call for complete prohibition. Early on, the call was for, we need to get rid of whiskey. Whiskey is so addictive and so cheap to make in the new world because of our crops. It's so cheap and it's so addictive. We need to get rid of hard liquor. Wine and beer was considered fine. The alcohol content just wasn't enough to cause, the factory workers that were coming over from Europe to fill the new factories couldn't buy enough beer and wine to make a serious problem. They could buy enough whiskey to make a serious problem. And the drive for prohibition was, we need to find a middle ground that says, yes, you can drink a little, but you can't drink this. And that's what the prohibition move for about 50 years was. We need to get rid of whiskey. It was the anti-whiskey and the anti-saloon league. And then it started to gain momentum and started to get some political clout it was almost entirely a women's movement early on, and women had no political clout and were not politicians.
They couldn't vote.
As prominent pastors jumped in, and then prominent politicians, and then prominent businessmen who realized how many hours of labor they were losing to drunkenness, suddenly they realized, we have a lot of power here. why don't we go further? And that's where you started to see calls for total prohibition, total, which they said total with a capital T. I am for total prohibition with a capital T, which is the source of the expression, you're a teetotaler, a capital T, total prohibition. And that was an overreach that created the disaster that was prohibition, because they had enough political power for about 2 years to get it through Congress and get it through all the states. And we had prohibition. We succeeded ideologically, less so than practically, in banning all alcohol. And it was a disaster because most of the country didn't want it. And ignored it. And so my concern is when, suddenly you smell blood in the water, it's like, hey, I think we have the votes. I think we have the votes that we could, the majority of Americans would like abortion reduced, would like abortion controlled more than it is. And the model of a Netherlands or a Denmark or, where you can't get an abortion past 12 weeks, you can't get an abortion past 15 weeks at the latest, which is kind of the standard for much of Europe. I just think we forget that we're in a democracy, and that if you really override, which is why we're here in the first place, because so many people felt like Roe v. Wade overrode the will of the people, and so we've been fighting back, but it feels like now, because we feel like, oh, we got the wind at our backs, we got the wind in our sails, we're going to override the will of the people in the other direction, and we could create prohibition version 2 with everything that went along with that.
But don't you think that is yet to be seen? If the court does get rid of...
Of course, the future is always yet to be seen, Skye.
My hope would be, I don't know if this is a hope, but when you look at the polling, there are very, very few Americans who vote either on the right or the left based on abortion. And when you look again at the polling, most people seem to have very common sense attitudes about wanting to reduce the number of abortions. And yet the extremes on both sides don't reflect the reality or the popular wisdom of the American people. So my assumption is, if you remove the constitutional issue from the equation and you let each state wrestle with this on their own, this gets to Caitlin's point, will you see enough common sense govern this issue so that you come up with compassionate laws that understand the importance of respecting the life of the preborn, but don't impose a burden on a woman that we're not prepared to deal with. So I am strongly pro-life. I'm not arguing against that by any means, but in this country, as diverse as it is, I don't think you pass a complete prohibition against abortion, but we can pass common sense legislation that does reduce it. And I would hope that that's the outcome in some of these states. And then you have the church and other people step in and give as much care and support to women who are pregnant and are contemplating abortion that we can reduce it even further. I think the law gets in the way here.
Here's where we are ideologically, okay? And I'm going to grab the Southern Baptist Convention as Exhibit A. Southern Baptist Convention last year, the big show, when they were like, who's going to be the new president and all that, and what are we going to do?
Show.
Yeah, the big show, the big Southern Baptist show.
Okay.
That one of the things that passed was a reaffirmation that Southern Baptists were for the complete prohibition of abortion. That you don't know, we're not trying to just gradually reduce the number of abortions. We want to abolish abortion. That's the official position of Southern Baptist Convention.
It's not possible.
Okay.
They haven't always thought that either.
But hang on.
Right.
Hang on.
You can make something illegal. It doesn't mean it's been eliminated.
Hang on, Skye.
Okay.
I'm not done.
All right.
Put your hair back on and calm down. In 1970, a poll conducted by the Baptist Sunday School Board found that 70% of Southern Baptist pastors supported abortion to protect the mental or physical health of the mother.
Wow.
64% of Southern Baptist pastors supported abortion in cases of fetal deformity, and 71% in cases of rape. So the majority of Southern Baptist pastors supported abortion in some cases in 1970. A 1971 SBC resolution on abortion captured this consensus. Here's was the SBC talking about abortion in 1971. Society has a responsibility to affirm through the laws of the state a high view of the sanctity of human life, including fetal life. But then it went on and said, we call upon Southern Baptists to work for legislation that will allow the possibility of abortion under such conditions as rape, incest, clear evidence of fetal deformity, and carefully ascertained evidence of the likelihood of damage to the emotional, mental, and physical health of the mother.
Which sounds a lot like the policy in much of Western Europe.
It does. It does. Sounds like the freaking Netherlands. In 1981, okay, this is eight years after Roe, okay? 8 years. This is Reagan is in the White House. A pamphlet published by the Christian Life Commission, that's the organization that became the ERLC, okay, Russell Moore's organization, the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission of the Southern Baptists, spoke of, this was the pamphlet in 1981, Christian concern for the value of the defenseless fetus, but went on to argue it is questionable that Christian love and justice would be served by extremely restrictive laws which do not give conscientious people with proper medical advice the opportunity to choose when they are faced with very grave moral dilemmas related to abortion. Okay, that was the SBC position in 1981 during the Reagan years. So what I'm concerned about, I guess, is how ideological this has become since then. That Southern Baptists were taking nuanced positions, thinking about, kind of all the complexities of the issue as late as 1981. And now to be a Southern Baptist, you have to say, nope, no compromise, no middle ground. It's all or nothing.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's bad.
and it's not just on this issue. There are many issues that
and the same thing is happening on the other side. The same thing is happening on the other side.
Yeah.
No compromise. There can be no restrictions on anything.
David French is obviously an expert on this stuff, and he's written a lot about it, and he's tweeted a lot about it, and he's put up a lot of stats that have come out recently from people like Ryan Burge and others. And again, it shows, despite the extreme positions held by people on the far right and the far left, the very, very few people actually vote primarily on the issue of abortion. And most Americans are in that middle somewhere who want common sense restrictions, who want more help and aid for women who are contemplating abortion, who don't agree with the very open-ended Roe v. Wade kind of parameters on it. They want something more like what's in Western Europe. So, I mean, you're right, Phil. There are these extremes, but they don't represent most people. They don't represent most Christians. They don't represent most liberals or conservatives. They're just the people who have the microphones and are making the most noise.
And making the most laws. I guess that's the concern. Who's making the laws? Is it the average person, or is it people in Congress who have been driven more? There aren't a whole lot of moderates in Congress. Who's going to come together? And especially if you paint, it's funny because when people first became pro-life in evangelical circles, some of the criticism was, well, that's a Catholic thing. That's a Catholic thing. And the reason is that it was associated with Catholic views on contraception. So particularly very early stage abortion was kind of viewed as, well, that's such a, that's kind of like saying that it's the Catholic position on everything, that you can't, that God intended you to procreate and have as many children as you can possibly have.
Every sperm is sacred, as Monty Python taught us.
Yeah. And so I just find it interesting. I'm not sure how we got to the position as evangelicals where we accept, we adopted the Catholic position on abortion, but rejected the Catholic position on contraception.
Or adopted the Catholic position on abortion and rejected it on capital punishment.
Right.
Or just generally Catholic social teaching on economics and communities. And
because the answer is politics.
Yes, Skye.
The answer is politics. We've talked about this before, is the way that, and we had Randall Ballmer on a couple months ago to talk about his book on the formation of the religious right, that they globbed onto this abortion issue to create a coalition of conservative white evangelicals and Roman Catholics in order to get the religious right off the ground. And that's what they ended up doing. So it isn't that this is built on a a cohesive theological or biblical argument for the social well-being of our society. It's built on a politically expedient argument that mobilized the right people into the right coalition to elect the right people. That's the problem.
Right.
So,
Cool.
and to your point, though, Phil, we see the same ridiculousness on the issue of guns. The majority of gun owners in America want more common sense restrictions on access to firearms and the sale of firearms. But people like the NRA and others won't give an inch on even the most common sense legislation, even though that's what the majority of Americans want. It's what the majority of gun owners want. More common sense restrictions on abortion is what most American women want. And yet our political leaders won't do it because the liberals have it, 1 inch on this and it's, the end of the world.
So for the record, I would like Roe v. Wade to be overturned. And the reason is because it put that marker on viability as the point where, you cannot have an abortion. You cannot restrict abortion before viability. And that is a much more liberal position than the vast majority of Europe that we have. So let's get rid of that. I'm just afraid that kind of in this, euphoria that could happen, that we did it. We did finally, after 50 years of trying, we overturned Roe v. Wade. We get crazy and go a little Handmaid's Tale. So,
well, yeah, and it's also the illusion. I mean, I'm 46 almost. Anybody my age or younger has just lived in an environment where abortion was constantly the rallying cry for so many conservatives, especially Christians. And you can live with the illusion that abortion didn't exist in America before Roe v. Wade. And it clearly did. We did a whole video on this.
Have you made any videos about that?
Yeah, we did. And in fact, the abortion rate today is lower than it was before Roe v. Wade. So simply removing this bad law, and I agree, I'm in favor of removing it, but simply removing it doesn't solve the issue. And my concern is a lot of the people who have rallied around Roe as a political incentive and a voting determiner and all, they're gonna, if they win this battle, they think, oh, we did it, and now we've got this unholy law off the books and we can feel innocent again living in a country that doesn't completely legalize abortion, and they let down their guard and don't do the hard work that actually needs to happen to care for real women and kids and families.
Right.
So it becomes a totem of sorts, a symbol that I'm no longer associated with this immoral law as an American. So my ledger is clear, and that's all I really care about. And that would be tragic if that's what happens.
Caitlin, before we wrap it up, first of all, I need you to tell me if you were impressed by my prohibition analogy, if you like.
Yeah, I mean, I think the moral of the story that you told is that men got involved and messed it up. So
wow.
The whole time you were telling the story, I was like, I've heard this one before.
There is a little bit of that. It became about political power and culture warring. Yeah, when you see Billy Sunday get in and start preaching about demon rum, and then more politicians jump in, and then it was like, hey, this is a winner take all battle.
Yeah.
We have a window of opportunity to 100% change America the way we think it should be. And unfortunately, self-government is not about 100% changing America to be what any one group wants it to be. And we really don't like that. I don't know if you women enjoy it, but you seem to be a little better with subtlety.
Well, I do think I was kidding a little bit, but also there is something true about women who were being more intimately affected by the problems of mostly men in their lives drinking and, getting violent or abandoning their family. Like it does tend to be the people who are most intimately affected by a problem that are more likely to be able to be engaged in conversations about it that don't turn into just a ploy for political power. But I wanted to go back to something you said earlier really quick, Phil, about people who are more conservative and have this weird combination of being against abortion but not wanting to be pro any kind of social safety net for people. And I do want to give people a little credit. I do think sometimes it is just sort of like that mismatched conservative ideas that they're ideologically, bound to and don't realize the contradictions. But sometimes it really is a genuinely held belief that churches and communities should be providing care for people as opposed to a whole government system. And I do think there's some good truth to that. And there's some, reasons for us to be really involved in our churches on behalf of people who are vulnerable. But I do think this is a good point to remind people that there is a real value to fixing structural problems, because individual communities helping women who are in especially vulnerable situations and get pregnant and need a, social safety net is one good, beautiful way to show the kingdom of God in your community. And yet it doesn't do what some larger structural issues, like a national paid family leave policy, like most countries in Europe that have those different abortion rates have, like a child tax credit. It doesn't do what those large structural things could do to create a culture that values children and families, and not just creates the structural conditions for women to make good choices about families and work and to support, the children that they have, but can also be involved in a larger cultural shift towards saying, we want to be a place that values life, including elderly life and disabled life and unborn life. And that kind of stuff can happen in really small scale in communities. But if we're so focused on this is the only answer is churches and, crisis pregnancy centers, whatever, those are all good things. But we tend to discount some of those structural things for reasons that could hypothetically in a vacuum be good. But in a situation like this, are preventing some real structural changes that could create the conditions where not only are there social safety nets nationally for women, but there also is a general, national culture that says, we think you having a child should not be a devastating thing in your life. And that's something that's represented in all sorts of ways, including in our policies.
How great would it be if in June, if the Supreme Court ruling comes out and they overturn Roe, if that week, that month, that day, a bunch of pro-life national activists, primarily Christians, came out and said, wow, we did it. After 50 years, we finally got Roe overturned. We're going to continue to fight these issues on the state level now because it's going to go back there. But we're going to take all of our national energy and we are going to put 100% of it behind as quickly as possible passing a National Family Leave Act that ensures women who are pregnant and have a child now can stay home with that kid and not lose their job. And we're going to do everything we can to make that a reality. That would be a morally upstanding and responsible thing to do in the wake of overturning Roe. But somehow I doubt that's likely to happen because it doesn't fit the political contours of our country the right way.
Well, there are the Center for Public Justice, which is a great organization of Christians working for political things, has a whole group right now doing a ton of work that I've been working with them on paid family leave policy. And it's not even necessarily just an inherent response to Roe v. Wade, though we've had so many conversations about the impact of Roe v. Wade and paid family leave policy. But it is just to say, there are Christians currently working on coalescing people at the institutional level, at denominational levels, trying to get Christians to think about this well theologically, not just to say this is a policy you should support pragmatically in the wake of, overturning Roe v. Wade, but also here's all the really rich theological reasons you should be in support of that. And they're doing really incredible work. And I could totally imagine them, if this was to happen, being a really good force for saying this is the right response for a Christian.
Wait, Caitlin. Did you just say that while you're working on your PhD at Duke, you're also working on national family leave policy?
I am one of many people involved in working on that.
Because I got to tell you, I smell an award coming around the corner.
Oh my gosh.
Maybe it's going to be called the Caitlin Chess Family Leave Act.
It will 100% not.
Yeah.
I am going to write my senator now.
No, you will not.
Do I have a senator? Okay. Thanks, everybody. It's been fun. If you agree, if you disagree, go to theholypost.com and let us know what we got wrong. I'm sure there were many things. Just to be clear one more time, I am in favor of overturning Roe v. Wade because I think that policy of you can't restrict abortion before viability is a really bad policy, and it wouldn't even fly in liberal Europe, and that needs to be off the books. I just am afraid when we overreach and get ideologically pure because we want to in a society that's built on the people governing themselves, where we need to actually compromise sometimes with our neighbors for the common good. And there we go. So churches, get ready for the Caitlin Schuss Memorial Family Leave Policy.
Memorial?
It's on its way.
Yeah.
Is it going to kill her in the process?
She had to put so much into this policy to get it passed that, God bless her, we lost her. But they named it in her honor. and we're very proud. And we will accept the award in her memory.
Oh, good.
Wow.
And convert it into Lego form. Okay. Thanks, everybody, especially our Patreon supporters, for making it possible for us to do this every week, and we will see you next time. The Holy Post podcast is funded by listeners like you who support us on Patreon. And this episode is also supported by Abide, the #1 Christian meditation app. This is Phil. Do you ever have trouble falling asleep at night? Do you ever wrestle with anxiety? No? Liar. We all do. Meditation apps are all the rage. But what the heck are you meditating on? Fill your mind with the Bible with the Abide meditation app. Abide's meditations start at just 2 minutes long. That's easy. You can do that. Get started now with 25% off a premium subscription by downloading the Abide app at abide.co/holypost. You'll get additional stories and meditations, premium music, soothing sounds, and more. Support the Holy Post podcast and get 25% off by going to abide.co/holypost. That's abide.co/holypost to download the Abide app and get 25% off your premium subscription. And now, back to the show.
My guest today is sociologist Josh Packard from Springtide Research Institute. We first had him on back in February to talk about research they'd done on Gen Z. Well, they're back with a brand new report on the state of young people and religion for 2021 with a lot of new data about Gen Z. The full report is available for download for free at the Springtide Research Institute website, and we'll put the link in the show notes. Here is my conversation with Josh Packard. Josh Packard, welcome back to the Holy Post.
Hey, thanks for having me back. It's I really enjoyed our conversation last time. I'm looking forward to this for a while now.
Yeah, well, we like having people on with facts rather than just opinions. Although you're welcome to share your opinions, but you're a guy who's got data and facts. So you guys have this new research project on Gen Z. What's the actual title of the thing?
Well, it's part of an annual study that we do every year called the State of Religion and Young People. And this year the focus is on how young people navigate uncertainty.
Okay, which is appropriate given the uncertainty of recent events in the past couple of years. Gen Z, for those who are not familiar with...
I thought you were coining a whole new generational cohort.
Gen C, yeah, that could be the letter C or the ocean. Gen Z is defined as currently young people who are ages 13 to 25, which captures all three of my kids. So I was very interested in looking at this data because I wanted to figure how much of this maps onto what I see with my kids and their friends. But talk about one of the big kind of developments I saw in the report, or the big findings, was what you guys are referring to as the unbundling of faith. Unpack what that means.
Well, it's worth, I think, noting that, generations are never the distinct containers that we sometimes try to shove them into. That a generation is one thing and especially this generation. I mean, Gen Z is the most diverse generation that's ever existed anywhere in any society. And so trying to claim that they are in any one thing is just, further away from the truth than it might have ever been. And so as an extension, though, of trends that have been impacting previous generations, but really coming home to roost with Gen Z, is this sort of disconnection from social institutions due to long-standing lack of trust that they have and that their parents have and previous generations before them have. What this means is that as Gen Z goes about trying to, ask and navigate, maybe get answers to, spiritual questions, religious kinds of concerns, they're doing so without the religious guides who still largely reside in those institutions. The result then is this thing that we coined this year, this unbundled faith, that they are sort of trying to find answers to various bits and pieces and show up, to conversations and places where they can, bring their various identities and values with them into those spaces.
So that means going to different sources and essentially creating your own bundle. So you might draw from, from the church or from an online forum or from a friend or from the yoga class you attend. It's this amalgamation of whatever it is in their life they find useful. Is that a fair way to put it?
Yeah, I think it is. And I'll preemptively say here that one of the things that it's not is this sort of individualistic, self-centered approach to religion. I mean, one of the things that was super interesting this year, talking to young people about their faith, is the way that this is done um, with that diversity that I mentioned, not only very present, but also as a really a top level value for this generation. And so that means that they're doing this in connection with one another and really trying to learn about different faith systems through the experiences of those around them. And then, picking up different practices and different pieces that resonate with them, that provide some utility for helping them to get through these situations. I mean, there's a concerning element to that, I suppose, in the sense that like some of these traditions go back obviously thousands and thousands of years, and the idea that you would like pick up pieces of them is sort of odd. They come with contexts and histories that are really important. So there's that. But we've been really, I think, heartened by two things. One is the reminder that everything that young people do, their whole entire lives, is really about change. You know what I mean? Like it's about exploration, and it's about trying on new identities and new things. And the person that you're dating at 14 is probably who you're not going to marry, and the faith that you have at 15 is not the faith you're probably going to have at 25 or 35. And so I keep that in the back of my head all the time. But then I've just been so struck by how like the genuine earnestness to understand these different traditions on their own terms. And I think that's, in part, that's just a way of trying to understand the very diverse world that they occupy. But it's also like a way that they told us over and over again was a way of like connecting with their peers online or in real life, which is, I think, super interesting.
So when you consider the trend of unbundling,
Mm-hmm.
what are the implications of that for those of us who might be leaders of a congregation or committed to a bundled tradition of spirituality, whether it's evangelicalism or Protestantism or Roman Catholicism, whatever our tradition? But like, what does that mean for us? Does it mean that we can no longer expect people to become full engaged members of our tradition, and we have to? We're all just free agents now. One of the things that comes to mind is when I was a young person, and that's multiple generations ago now, and was exploring these questions of faith. There was this, I don't know what to call it, a spillover effect, perhaps, where I meet an older person who, let's say, is a Christian, and I find them to be incredibly credible on, I don't know, let's say the front of understanding the Bible. They have a deep theological understanding of the Bible, and they're good at communicating it. And so I trust them with that. There's a spillover effect that, well, maybe then I will also trust them to give me advice about dating because they're trustworthy in one area. Maybe I should trust them in another. But it sounds like in the unbundling phenomenon, there's no spillover effect. Just because you find someone useful in one area doesn't mean you're going to accept what they have to say in another area. Is that fair?
Well, with one slight tweak, I think that's fair. So I think it is fair to say that just because I find, like one ritual from a tradition useful in one area, it does not mean that they're going to take on that entire faith tradition. The tweak there is about the object of that sentence, where, you said just because I find someone credible in one particular area, there's a spillover effect. That is still very true. I mean, relationships are, in fact, probably more important now than they've ever been, because those relationships, the trusted relationships, do have a distinct spillover effect. I mean, the metaphor I like to use a lot to help explain this is, I think that for a long time, faith, maybe up until the internet in this country, was take it or leave it. I mean, it was like going to a restaurant and a waiter brings you something to eat, and you can either say yes or no. Your only real agency there is to choose to eat or not to eat. And then at some point, like the world gets a little bit more diverse. We have more access to ideas, and it's more like ordering off of a menu. I mean, as recently as far away, maybe whatever. When I was growing up, I remember distinctly knowing, even if it wasn't like readily present, I at least was aware of the fact that, there's this whole system out there of Judaism, and there's this whole system out there of Hinduism, and I could, if I wanted, to sort of like shed the Christian system that I was brought up in and adopt one of those. So it was like ordering off of a menu in that way. But the metaphor for faith unbundled that I think helps to capture and explain what Gen Z is going through is like a dinner party. So it's it's not a cafeteria where you get whatever you want, and it's not a food court where you order a little bit of this and a little bit of that, but it's really like a potluck dinner party where you're going with a bunch of friends in community together. They're bringing dishes from home that they've made, all with all the ingredients. You didn't get to order it without onions or whatever the things are, and then you end up with this plate of spiritual food, to really extend the metaphor, which is this very odd looking plate that comes complete with not just other traditions, but other people's experiences of those traditions as you look to sort of figure out what's going to make the right meal or the best meal for you today.
So, continuing with your metaphor, then, by what criteria are young people choosing what to put on the plate? Is it just a utilitarian criteria, like what works, what's useful, or is there any sense that you just don't mix certain things? I'm trying to think of a really gross metaphor of what would be horrible to put together on a plate, but there are certain traditions, like certain Christian traditions, which claim exclusivity.
Yeah.
Where you might find a certain practice from Hinduism really cool or helpful, but the worship of another god, especially in the form of an idol, would be anathema to many Christians, Jews, and Muslims. So you just can't mix those things.
Correct.
So how does that? What is this generation doing with those historic incompatibilities? Are they just pushing them aside, going, it doesn't matter anymore, we can put whatever on the plate we want?
Well, as we're talking about such a diverse group of people, we're going to find all kinds of answers, and that's a big. That's certainly, that element is present. Because here's part of what's happening is that we've got a lot of young people that are telling us, now for 23,000 surveys we've done over the last couple of years and nearly 250 interviews, who are telling us that they really are interested in these questions. They are 75% of young people describe themselves as religious or spiritual in some way. But there's a lot of diversity within that category. A lot of people asking, what are essentially religious questions, and really looking for guides to do it. And we've got a lot of really well-meaning adults who want to help them out. Now, what happens is that the young people are saying, like, I'll take the guidance. I want answers. I want to know how other people have dealt with these questions. I'm just not going to cross your threshold, real or metaphorical. Like, I'm not coming into your building. I'm not showing up to your program. That is not going to be my first step, towards connecting with a guide who could help me understand how incompatible some of these things are, or, what the nuances are of these particular faith or belief systems. And we've got these guides, on the other hand, who genuinely care so much about young people, and they're inside of those institutions saying, I'll do anything for you. You just have to step across the threshold of this door. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, they're just not, like, that's the gap that exists. And, so young people are looking for these things. So yeah, some of them are trying to figure out, like, does Hinduism match up with Christianity? Like, can I be a Jewish and Buddhist at the same time? Or are there parts of that can make sense for me? So we identified in the report, like, the aspects of this faith unbundle that they're really interested in. It's curiosity, wholeness, connection, and flexibility. But at the core of all that is, an unwillingness to take on a whole system of belief where they can't show up as their whole selves. It's almost like that's the bargain that young people are saying, is like, oh, you want me to adopt this whole system? Well, I have to be able to be all of who I am in order to do that. And if you're not willing to, shake hands there, then I think you're going to continue to see this sort of part and parceling out.
Okay, now we're getting into the territory about your report that I find some skepticism about. Not your report, but about this generation.
Sure.
And it's not unique to Gen Z. I think this is probably true of any adolescent, of any generation.
Mm-hmm.
It's certainly true of me. But when I was 13 to whatever it is, 25, I don't know if I knew who I was all that well.
Absolutely not.
Right. Enough to say, hey, if I'm going to be part of your faith tradition or your institution, then you need to let me be my authentic self. It's like, well, I don't even know what my authentic self is. So in other words, when your survey pulled that result out, was that another way for Gen Z to say, hey, I'm willing to participate with your group or team or institution as long as I'm not uncomfortable? Is that really what they're saying? Don't make me do anything that is going to challenge me.
Yeah, I don't think challenge is the right word. This really comes down, I think more to a sense of wholeness surrounding identities. And some of that, I mean, you're right. Like, you're going to run into some people, a certain amount of young people who are saying, this is who I am. And then you're going to check back in 6 months later and they're going to say they are something different. And they're going to say it with
Right.
equal amounts of conviction, you know what I
Right.
mean? With no cognitive dissonance about the fact that 6 months ago you said something completely, but that's what being young is.
Exactly.
I mean,
I'm not faulting them for it. It's just
right.
youth. Right.
And so it's not so much about like, do you check the boxes for all the things that they want to be? I mean, I think that, look, like, that's a dangerous place for any religious system or group to do, is to try and figure out how we can cater to,
Right.
To a particular group. I just heard some language around this that I really love. Instead of, looking for relevance, you look for resonance. And that really resonated with me as, what they're not looking for, Gen Z gave us no sort of indication in this survey or in any other that they're looking for you to compromise your beliefs. Now, what they are looking for, though, is a sense that you can authentically engage them around those beliefs, that there's not like, gosh, I really don't. I really loved my experience in churches growing up, and so I don't want it to. But it was sort of a bait and switch. It was like this: come for the fun, like we're gonna have a water balloon fight and a pizza party, and then like we're gonna slide in a little bit of God, and like that was super effective for me. I think largely because it was a system built for people who came from suburban spaces like me and looked like me, and
Sure.
had families like mine, etc. But this generation is just so much more skeptical of that sort of stuff. I mean, they want to know what you're about up front, and they want to know if they get to be, who they are, knowing that they might be somebody different in 6 months or in 3 years or 5 years.
Yeah, one of the, I forget where it is in the report, but one of the super high values they hold is authenticity. And
Sure.
it sounds like that applies both to themselves and to whoever they're engaging. So my interpretation was, it isn't that they want a religious organization to accommodate to what they want as much as they want to know that this religious leader or institution is being upfront and direct about who they are. And
that's right.
We've had generations, and when I was being trained in ministry, like, I don't think it was presented this way, but underneath it kind of was. It took its cues from the marketing visions of secular America, which basically said, study the audience you're trying to engage and cater to what they want. And that's kind of the opposite of what we're hearing from this younger generation, which is just be who you are, like be authentic to your religious tradition, and I will take it or leave it based on your authenticity, but don't try to fake it to get me in and do the bait and switch kind of thing. Okay, let's talk about the values gap, because this is probably one of the more interesting parts of your report. Essentially, you asked young people, Gen Z, what are issues they care about, and you kind of rank them, and we'll get into what some of these issues are, and then you ask them whether their perception was that religious communities cared about. How much did they care about these issues? And there's a gap between how much they care and what they perceive religious communities care. Why is this data important or valuable?
Yeah, that's exactly the right question to be asking. I mean, so we got, if the right way to understand how young people are engaging with faith is increasingly through this unbundled lens, well, we wanted to know why. Like, why unbundle all of these things, or why take them in piece by piece instead of just engaging with an entire system? And part of that answer came back to these really key social issues that are surrounding a set of values that young people hold to be paramount in their lives. And then there's just a real disconnect that they see along these things. Now, part of what's really weird about this is that while young people will say things like, I don't trust youth ministers, but I like my youth minister. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like last year, when we looked at just the affiliated young people, so young people checking the box as Christian or Buddhist or whatever, like half of young people who are affiliated say that they don't trust organized religion. So this is really interesting, right? I mean, it's that this really is something that occurs at the micro level. Now, what that means is that, generally speaking, lots and lots and lots of young people, even those who are religious, do not see other religious people as part of their in-group. And sociologically, what happens is that when we talk about who's not in our in-group, the people in our out-group, we're we're quicker to paint with a broad brush. We're less forgiving of mistakes. And this is where stereotypes come in. And we're sort of operating on some pretty broadly held assumptions. So I think it's largely what we've got here is that after now a long time of institutional mistrust and disconnection, we've got religious communities largely serving as an out group for young people. And so when we ask young people, how much do you care about these issues? They tell us, 71% say they care a lot about LGBTQ plus rights. 77% say they care a lot about gender equity and immigration rights and income inequality. But they think that and even when they describe themselves as religious, they still say, oh, but I don't think religious communities care about those things. So that, they only think 44% of religious communities care about LGBTQ plus rights, only 52. So there's a 20-point gap on all of these issues. The ones I've mentioned, plus disability rights, environmental causes, reproductive rights, racial justice, gun reform, et cetera. It's fascinating. I don't think I think, like a lot of the work we do at Springtide, it can be really easy to get carried away with one data point, but the real story is in the combination of this.
Yes.
And that's the thing that matters here. It's not that there's a 15% difference in gun reform. It's that there's a consistent gap on all of these issues.
Right. Okay. So that's what I wanted to talk about because there's so much here that I found interesting. First of all, I got to call some BS on some of this stuff because not again on your data. I think you're reporting accurately what the young people are reporting. It's what they're saying about themselves that I'm going, come on.
Okay, sure.
You're telling 80% of teenagers, essentially, 80% say they care deeply about disability rights. What are they doing that indicates they care about disability rights? Other than, for me, it feels like a little bit of a halo effect, right? Where you're asking them, do you care about gay rights, gender equality, immigration, income inequality? And they're looking at this list and they're going, yeah, I care about all those things. And they're saying, yes, I care, because they want to feel like they care. But I mean, it'd be like asking me, do I care about, I don't know, the persecution of the Uyghurs, the Muslim Uyghurs in China? Do I care? Yeah. I care. I care. What am I doing? I am doing absolutely nothing to help the Uyghurs in China. So do I really care? Well, no, I just want to, say I care because that's the right thing to say. So you have these young people saying they care about all these issues, and their perception is that they care about these issues more than the religious community they're a part of. In other words, it's a very self-righteous survey that says, well, I care about it, but the people around me don't.
So I think if, and part of this data, this is some of the very last data that we collected, in part because the story unfolded just as I told it to you, that we got interested in this, like as we started seeing this faith unbundled things come up, we were then poking around and asking, questions for a hypothesis about why. And this is the one that bore out. And so we don't actually know this, but I think what they would say is that, if they're a part of a religious community, they would say, I care and my religious community cares, but religious people don't care. Back to that notion that I like my youth minister, but I don't trust youth ministers.
Right.
And I do, and I think I don't disagree. I'm sure there's some sort of halo effect, but I think it is actually the halo effect that matters. I mean, if you put all these things together, what it tells us is that young people are largely telling themselves a story that says, I care about, social justice and the least of those around me, the ones who have been persecuted, the ones who have not been treated fairly. And I don't think religious people care about those things. I don't think, generally speaking, that religious communities care about social justice and the least of those, at least not to the same extent that I do.
Yeah. I mean, two things are coming to mind that I saw recently, and these are certainly not data-based. One was Bill Maher, who's a comedian who does the HBO show. He did this whole thing about Gen Z basically cares more about environmental concerns than older generations because, we've all screwed up the planet as older people and the young people care about it. But then he went through and looked at how are they actually living? And they're just as consumeristic as we were. They talk the talk of environmental concern, but when it comes down to it, they're just as bad for the planet as any other generation. Sure. And then the New York Times recently put out a video talking about blue states like where Democrats have complete control over the state, the governor, the legislature, all of it.
Yeah.
And what do they actually do when they have power? And what they showed is they talk a big game about housing and taxes and other kinds of issues that are on the progressive agenda, but they end up behaving just like the red states on these issues. So it feels a little bit to me like on these various social concerns, these social justice issues, the younger generation is saying, yeah, we care. But when it comes down to it, they're just like the rest of us. They want to be perceived as caring, but they're not actually doing anything about it. And so then it becomes, we have to demonize the out group as caring less in order to inflate our own sense of self righteousness. It's virtue signaling, in other words. And I'm not saying that Gen Z is unique in this. I'm saying we all do this. But at the end of the day, if they perceive religious communities as caring less than they do, isn't that just another way of saying I'm better than they are? And like, what's the usefulness in this data is kind of what I'm getting back to. Like, what do we do with this perception? I agree. I think the perception you've reported here is absolutely accurate.
Right.
Whether or not it's reality is a different matter. I think the perception they have of themselves and others is accurate, but what does it mean?
Yeah, that's a really good distinction. I mean, they think that, so for example, on like gender equity, they say 77% of them say that they care a lot. Only 52% of them think that religious communities care a lot. I know a lot of religious people who care a great deal about gender equity.
Right.
It's not so much that I think that that's an accurate number, but I agree with you that I think that it's an accurate perception that they have.
Right.
The reason why I think that the story matters, though, for religious leaders in this country is that, real or perceived, I mean, there's an old saying in my field of sociology, that which people perceive as real is real in its consequences. Ask yourself which organizations you belong to and really are devoted to that are that misaligned with your own personal values and causes and interests. And I'm going to guess that the list is zero. That you probably...
But that's precisely the point. Like, I'm questioning whether or not these young people actually care about these issues to the degree they say they do.
Sure. No, and my point though is that I don't like when it comes to, this generation figuring out whether they're going to engage with, faith communities, unless there's something done that dramatically changes that perception gap, I think we can expect that they're largely just not going to engage with these systems. And I think that's why the data matter. We wrote an article on the Poor People's Campaign that came out in RNS and Washington Post that there's a decent number of young people, surprisingly high number of young people who engage in protest as a spiritual practice on a pretty regular basis.
Mm-hmm.
But look, none of, and of course, they'll say that they care about these things, but look, none of those things are sustainable ultimately without institutional supports. And so, it's just that is just the truth of anything that you're going to try and do in life. We cannot educate the masses without institutionalized education, not for very long. I don't think you can sustain a thriving spiritual life in a society without good, strong religious institutions. But just because those institutions exist does not mean that they have to be engaged with. And I think that's part of the signal that we're sort of getting here from young people, is that they can walk away from them,
right,
and choose not to engage with them.
Perhaps one of the more acute examples of this, sorry, lost my train of thought, and there's been a number of reports about this, is the Black Lives Matter movement is largely a secular movement, whereas the earlier generations of Black civil rights leaders found the church, the Black church, to really be the base of their organization and support. And a lot of younger Black folks who are seeking a change to the systems are just bypassing the church. They're not engaging in. They think they can do it without the church. And is that kind of an example of what we're seeing on all these fronts of justice? Is like young people care about a bunch of issues, or at least they say they care about a bunch of these issues, and it doesn't occur to them that the church or a religious institution might be a good partner in pursuing these things.
Well, I'm not so sure that it doesn't occur to them. I think it's more about, when they do these things, when they're engaged in this kind of work, which I think the rates here are higher than maybe we might suspect. I mean, even just looking at some of the exit polling from last year's election for 18 and older was pretty eye-opening. it's the question is, when they're doing this kind of work and they look left and they look right, I mean, who do they see next to them? I mean, are they seeing pastors and rabbis and imams with them, or are they not? And I think largely, they're not. And it's, look, we were talking about the environment with some leaders this summer as an issue, and going around about this, and they said, so we should start in our parish, we should start an environmental club. I was like, no, I think you're missing the point. Like, like that would have been a great idea 25 years ago, when institutions were still, like, religious institutions were still seen as a or the primary organizing force in a young person's life. But now, like, we're a couple of decades past that conversation, and you have to go to where they are.
And this might be a good place to wrap up. One of the more interesting findings in this report is that while all young people are struggling more and have lots of uncertainty and anxiety and stuff, you found that those who are more religious are doing better than young people who are not. Unpack that.
Yeah, and I mean, the real key is the difference between those who are very religious and those who are not religious at all. So it's sort of a mixed bag in the middle there, but especially on those two ends of the spectrum, what we see is that, generally speaking, I think there's some good reason to believe that religion does serve as a protective factor there, which is, the social science community has sort of been trying to figure out the answer to this question, objectively speaking, for everybody for a long time now. And I'm not so sure that it can be neatly buttoned down like that. The religion is always good or religion is always bad. For this generation, what we're seeing is that for a lot of young people, having some place where at least there is like an access to certainty, or like a path, maybe not right now, but eventually, if I develop and grow enough, like, we could get some answers to some of these questions, or take some comfort in knowing that there is, at least, these are the contours of the unknown. I would. I mean, these are somewhat tentative, and the kind of findings that push us into that 2022 focus on the religious aspects of mental health, because we saw those same things too. That flourishing does seem to be correlated for this generation to a certain extent with being engaged with the religious community. That's our firm belief at Springtide. That in order for a young person to flourish, their faith lives have to be well considered and well attended to. Otherwise, they just can't.
And to be clear, your data doesn't say people who are connected to a conservative evangelical Christian church are flourishing and everyone else.
Correct.
This is people connected to a religious community in a significant way. In general, it could be Christian, non-Christian, Buddhist, Hindu.
Yeah, we didn't see,
Jewish,
we would have reported it if we had seen differences within those, but we didn't.
Which makes me think that in general, a religious community offers certain basic human structures that we need to thrive, like intergenerational community, a place to connect to the transcendent, a place to reflect and have mentors, and all those things that just good
meaning and purpose in life.
Meaning and purpose, right? These are things, the structures that families and communities have historically provided in a human setting for thousands and thousands of years, but we've become so disconnected that it's harder to get that. And for a lot of young people, one place that they're more likely to get it is in a religious community.
And it's that gets us back to my concerns about being, institutionally disconnected. Well, then what supports that exploration? I mean, either for an individual or for a society as a whole. I know people are really, people are innovative and they come up with new solutions, but this one seems like a particularly challenging one right now.
Yeah, and I keep saying one last thing. One of the statistics that stood out to me was only 10% of young people who are connected to a faith community said that they've been reached out to by a leader of the faith community and engaged in any significant way.
No, that number is 10% of all young people. This is perhaps the most stunning thing. I mean, so we go through a whole year of the pandemic. We asked right at the beginning of the pandemic this question: who's reached out to you?
Right.
Only 1% of young people said that a faith leader had. You and I may have talked about this before. We asked them a year later, in March of 2021, who has reached out to you, and that number goes up to 10%. So only 10% of young people said that a faith leader had reached out to them. And I think that this points to not the failure of individuals, but it says something about the way that our systems of doing religion are set up, which is that they're largely set up to do really good work inside of particular institutional constraints, that we just haven't built very good relational outlets to be able to do relationships at scale yet. And I think that's what you see in that data point, which is also heartbreaking.
And speaking at least from a Christian point of view and from a pastoral point of view, through most of Christian history, the role of the pastor or any minister was to spend his or her time primarily outside the church building, engaging with people in their homes and in the fields and factories and hospitals and jails, or what, just out in the community. And then on Sunday, they would gather together and that pastor would lead the congregation in worship. But for most of their effort and time, it was ministering to people in the community. And then some time ago, we decided to reverse that. And we said, okay, ministers, you stay in the building all week long. And if people want to be cared for and served, they need to come to you. So it puts the initiative on the part of the congregant to seek out the expertise or help or input of the minister. And I wonder if this generation, what they're telling us through your data and others, is we need to go back to the old way of doing things, where we need to not expect people to be drawn to the institution because there's so much distrust and other issues there, but we need to be out in the community building the connections and relationships and forming those bonds of trust directly with the people we want to minister to.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, that model that you described of the, if you build it, they will come. I mean, that is an entire model predicated on high institutional trust. It's not a good or a bad model. It just is a model that works in a world where there's high institutional trust. It is also not a model then that is particularly effective in the world that we currently occupy, which is one of low institutional trust. And so that turn back to relationships, there are things we can learn from the last 50 years that have been really effective, like how to do things at scale, how to do things in a broadcast way. But what we have to do now is relationships at scale, not, buildings and programs and institutions at scale. And, so in some ways it calls for the pastor to return to that other role largely.
Well, Josh Packard, thank you so much for coming back to the Holy Post. A reminder, the report is called The State of Religion and Young People 2021. You can get it at the springtideresearch.org website for free digitally, and the hard copy or print version of it is available at a pretty minimal cost. So I highly recommend checking it out. There's tons of interesting stuff here that we didn't even have time to get to. But I look forward to the next time you're back on the show, because you always have really insightful data for us. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's a great conversation.
The Holy Post podcast is a production of Phil Vischer Enterprises, that's Phil's company, and Skye Pilot Media, that's Skye's company. Production assistance by Julie Betcher. Editing by Jason Rugg. Help us create more thoughtful Christian media by supporting us at patreon.com/Holy Post. Also, be sure to leave a review on iTunes so more people can discover thoughtful Christian commentary plus ukulele and occasional butt news. Visit holypost.com for show notes, news stories, and more.